They are two simple but powerful words. God rested. Two simple but powerful words. God rested. I read earlier from the 2nd chapter of the book of Genesis these words, by the 7th day God had finished the work he had been doing. So on the 7th day God rested from all his work. God rested. Now the Hebrew verb there is shavat, S-H-A-V-A-T, and it means to stop working, to rest, to cease from what you're doing. And from it has derived, both in the Jewish tradition and the Christian tradition, the time we call Sabbath, Sabbath time. Sabbath time, simply put, is time to stop, to reconnect with God, and to be renewed. Sabbath time. Time to stop, to reconnect with God, and to be renewed. So let's flesh that out this morning. Let's think more about this time in our lives called Sabbath time. First of all, we each must have set-apart time. Each and every one of us needs what I call set-apart time. I've mentioned before an author named Dr. Richard Swenson. I've mentioned some of his books. Two of them in particular are titled Margin and the Overload Syndrome. And in the Overload Syndrome, Dr. Swenson says this: progress has given us unprecedented affluence, education, technology, and entertainment. We have comforts and convenience other eras could only dream about. Yet, we are not flourishing under the gifts of the modern world as one would expect. Otherwise, why are all the therapist offices so full? Something is wrong. People are tired and frazzled. People are anxious and depressed. We must have some room to breathe. We need some room to breathe. Each and every one of us needs some set-apart time. Notice here in the 6th chapter, when the disciples, after going out two by two into the Palestinian countryside, return, and they are absolutely worn out, and there are more crowds pressing in around Jesus to receive from them and from him, what Jesus does. He says, let's get away from here. Come apart with me, and let's go off by ourselves so that we can rest, so that you can rest. Here's Jesus with his disciples returning from an important preaching and teaching and healing ministry, telling them, I need you to stop and to rest. And if you read thoroughly the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, you'll discover readily that Jesus himself needed such time. There are numerous illustrations of the times that Jesus pulled apart from the crowd and went up on a mountain, or got in a boat and ran across the lake, or went off to some solitary place by himself. I mean, here's the Son of God, the Lord Jesus, who's supposed to preach and teach and heal and take care of all those who come to him, and he knows he needs to get off on a mountain somewhere. Get in a boat and cross the lake. Get apart from the crowd, because Jesus knows this: none of us can thrive spiritually and mentally and emotionally if we don't take time to breathe and to get apart. There is not a human being alive, preachers included, who can thrive if we don't have some set-apart time. First thing. Second thing, and you may not believe a preacher is going to say this, sometimes we need to say yes to self and no to others. Sometimes we need to say yes to self and no to other things. I don't know if you know the name Ruth Haley Barton or not. She's a Christian thinker and writer. She writes in particular about contemplation and the place of silence and solitude in our lives. And she's written a book titled Invitation to Solitude and Silence. I recommend it to you. And in that book, she tells about an occasion when she was going to go off to a retreat, a multi-day retreat. And she'd been looking forward to this retreat for some time. She knew that she needed that retreat. But she writes about getting to the airport and starting to have anxieties about leaving her work and leaving her family. And here's what she writes. I was sitting at Chicago O'Hare Airport waiting for my flight to Washington. for this spiritual and emotional time apart. I was looking forward to this time of stillness, reflection, and then the anxieties hit me. So she's at the airport. She's about to head off to this retreat, and she starts having some anxieties. These are the anxieties. Will everybody survive without me? What if something occurs in my daughter's lives and I'm not around to give what only a mother can give? What about work? Can I really afford to be completely out of the loop at such an important time in my vocational life? Will my husband be able to handle a full-time job along with managing the home front? Will I be disciplined enough to leave my cell phone off for a while and resist the temptation to regularly check my email? Or will I be distracted by the urge to sneak a listen or attend to the supposedly urgent message? And how far behind will I get if I go on this retreat? So here's a woman who specializes in contemplation and solitude, who's about to head out to this wonderful spiritual retreat. She gets to the airport, and all of a sudden, all the questions come. Can I really do this? Can I take the time? Can I leave? Can I leave work behind? Can I, for this short experience, leave my family behind? And she said after those anxieties had settled into her, God spoke to her two things. One, you need this. You need this. And the second thing, you will in the end be a better professional, a better mother, a better wife, and a better Christian if you'll take care of yourself. I like that. You'll be a better professional, a better wife, a better mother, and a better Christian if you take time for yourself, if you say yes to self. I had a conversation this past week with one of our members. He's in his early 40s. And I had emailed him about serving on an administrative committee in the life of our church. I see this man as a future leader of Germantown United Methodist Church. And as we're looking to develop our leadership for 2016 and beyond, I emailed him and I said, I'd love to meet with you and talk about serving on this particular committee. And I said to him in that email, I think you're going to be a future leader of this congregation. And I'd like for you to start here. He agreed to meet me for breakfast. We met on Tuesday morning. I laid out the administrative responsibilities. I laid out the key role that he would play in that. I laid out that he would be a future leader of this congregation. I laid out what I saw to be the gifts and attributes that he could bring to this particular ministry. And then he said to me, he said, you know, I think I could serve there. I think I have the gifts for that particular role in the life of the church. But here's what I need to do. I need to pray, and I need to talk to my wife, and I need to think about this season in my life. This season of work and family and the responsibilities therein. So he said, I'll call you Thursday. Well, he called me Friday. I was at a funeral, and he left me this message. I do think after time in prayer that this season of life might not be the most accommodating for me to focus and give attention to this important work in the church. Don't count me out, however. I hope to be in a better place with work and family needs in about a year and a half. I would love to serve then. And I texted him back, and you know what I said? Thank you. Thank God. Thank God that somebody understands the season of his life with maturity and understands that sometimes it is right for us to say yes, and God expects us to say yes, and sometimes the most spiritually mature thing you can do is to say no. Now, I guarantee you that there's not a preacher alive who asks people to do something who wants a no, or we wouldn't ask you. But I also want to tell you this morning that if saying no is the best way for you to have the proper Sabbath time in your life and take care of yourself, and tell Richard Smith no, and tell Brad Gabriel no, and tell Ryan Boatwright no, and tell each of us no. God expects you to say yes when the time is right to say yes, but God also understands when we might have to say no. Sometimes saying no to others and yes to self is the best thing in the world we can do for ourselves. And let me tell you, for God in the church too. Third thing, we need to pause and pay attention to the simple joys and wonders of everyday life. One biblical thinker, and I love this, one biblical thinker says, and pay attention, that the reason God rested was not because he was exhausted, for enjoyment. So this biblical scholar looking in on Genesis 2 says God didn't rest because he was exhausted. God rested because of enjoyment. In other words, he said God backed up and he looked, I just got to enjoy this. 6 days of creation, I just got to enjoy this. Wow. Wow. I want to soak it up, God said, according to this biblical scholar. Not because I'm exhausted, because I want to enjoy this time, this creation. I don't know if you saw the story this week about Tilly and Phoebe or not. I'm not going to ask you whether you did or not. And I'm going to say right off the bat that if you're an animal lover, you're going to be elated I'm telling this story. If you're not, you're going to think that Richard's sermons have gone to the dogs. Because Tilly and Phoebe are dogs. It's a true story. It was in the paper this week. So thankful it made the headlines. How many saw it? Well, you need to see it. I'll tell you part of the story. Tilly is a setter, and Phoebe is a basset hound. True story now. Headlines were dog stands guard for a week with friend. That was a headline. I'm a dog lover. Caught my attention. Well, Tilly's a setter. Phoebe is a basset hound. And Tilly and Phoebe were romping through the woods of Washington State and got lost. And while they were roaming, Phoebe, the basset hound, fell into a concrete cistern from which she could not get out. And for a week, the setter Tilly would sit guard at that concrete cistern with her head resting on the concrete, looking in on Phoebe. And then she would run off occasionally out of the woods wherever she thought she might find people, and she would bark in order to bring them back to Phoebe. And then go back into the woods, back to the cistern, lay her head there, and be there with Phoebe. Back out into some clearing, looking for somebody, barking, trying to bring attention to her little friend who's caught in that deep cistern. And finally, a couple who was walking on their property saw this, as they put it, reddish dog come out of the woods and bark at them, and then run back into the woods, come back out and bark at them and run out in the woods. And they keep walking. The dog runs out of the woods, barks at them, and then runs back into the woods. And they realize the dog is trying to get them to come into the woods. So they call the animal rescue. And they find, thankfully, that Phoebe is okay, and that Tilly and Phoebe are cold and hungry, but okay, because Tilly stood guard with her friend, for a week. Now, a lot of folks are thinking, why is the preacher telling this story? It's just an animal story. No, this is a creation story. This is a give thanks to God story. This is a heartwarming story. This is about taking the moment to appreciate the simple joys of life and the wonder of creation. Pausing long enough to soak it up like God soaked it up and say, thank you, God, for things like Tilly and Phoebe. One of my favorite poems, which I've shared before, is titled, Slow Me Down, Lord. This applies to me and it applies to you. Slow me down, Lord. Ease the pounding of my heart by the quieting of my mind. Steady my harried pace with a vision of the eternal reach of time. Help me to know the magical power of sleep. Teach me the art of taking minute vacations, of slowing down to look at a flower, to chat with an old friend or make a new one, to pat a stray dog, to watch a spider build a web, to smile at a child, or to read a few lines from a good book. Remind me each day that the race is not to the swiftest. Remind me to slow down and see the wonder and beauty of it all. Final thing, we need the spiritual nourishment that worship provides. The primary venue of Sabbath time in the Judeo and the Christian tradition is corporate worship. The primary venue of Sabbath time in our tradition is corporate worship. Worship is the time that you and I idle our motors, come into a place perhaps called a sanctuary, and let God speak to us, let God touch us, and let God empower us. I need this time, and you need this time. In another church some years ago, I was preaching a series on the Ten Commandments. And at the end of the service, a mother came up to me, a wife and mother came up to me and opened it by saying, we really needed to be here today. I'm so glad we came. This was a wife, a mother who had 2 teenage children and 1 preteen child for she and her husband. And she said, we needed this time today. You can't imagine how much we needed this time. And then with a mischievous smile on her face, she said, and I'm so glad that you preached on thou shalt not kill. 2 teenagers and a preteen, and a mom and a dad. And she said, because all morning I thought we were going to kill each other. We needed to be here. Well, you need to be here. And I need to be here. On a more serious level, this is the time and the place that God speaks to us in unique fashion, that he touches us and he empowers us as in no other time in our lives. To neglect worship is to neglect one's soul. It's to neglect the feeding of one's soul. There are 2 songs that speak to me about the meaning of worship. One is found in our hymnals, Spirit of the Living God, and you'll like this. You like this song. Spirit of the living God, fall afresh on me. Spirit of the living God, fall afresh on me. Melt me, mold me, fill me, use me. Spirit of the living God, fall afresh on me. Every time. Or from the Faith we sing, come and find the quiet center. Come and find the quiet center in the crowded life we lead. Find the room for hope to enter. Find the frame where we are freed. Clear the chaos and the clutter. Clear out eyes that we can see. All the things that really matter. Be at peace and simply be. You want a time to clear the chaos and the clutter? A time to see what really matters? It's worship. It's fundamentally corporate worship. God rested. Shabbat. Sabbath time. You need it, and I need it. And Sabbath time starts when we set apart time away from the hurriedness and the harriedness of it all. Every one of us needs set apart time. And it happens when we have the spiritual wisdom to say yes to self and no to other things if the season's not right. And it happens when we pause and pay attention to the wonder of it all and the simple joy of it all. And it certainly happens in worship. Shabbat. To stop, to reconnect with God, and to be renewed. Thanks be to God. Call your attention to our affirmation.